Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new session of the seminar of the Environmental Economics Association in Latin America. We are happy to come back to this series of seminars. Today, we have a very good presenter. It's Diego Herrera. Diego is an environmental economist at the World Bank Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economic Global Practice. At the World Bank, he is supporting global and country-level efforts to value natural capital and manage wealth accounting global databases. Before joining the World Bank, Diego was an economist at the Environmental Defense Fund and a postdoctoral associate at the Gann Institute for Environment, University of Vermont. Diego's research addresses the interactions between forest conservation and development outcomes and policies. Among other topics, Diego has studied the relationship between forest conservation and human health in low and middle income countries, and the impacts on Brazilian Amazon protected areas on deforestation, road investments, and human migrations. Diego also holds a PhD in environmental economics and policy from Duke University. Diego is an interesting researcher. Thanks, Diego, for joining to this seminar. And Diego is going to present a very interesting paper. It's about protected areas, deforestation, spillovers, and two critical underlying mechanisms, and empirical exploration from the Brazilian Amazon. Before giving you the word to you, Diego, it's important to mention that, for instance, in this part of Latin America, in the north west or the northeast of Latin America, we are suffering of this problem of deforestation. Actually, just for some of you that perhaps are not living in this part of the Latin America, we are facing a lot of problems with, for instance, in Colombia with narco traffic, some problems with the agricultural extension in the lands that try to destroy forests. And also this has impacts not only on biodiversity and the land, but also on the quality of the soil, but also in air quality. For instance, during this month, usually every year in Bogota, in Medellin, in the main capital cities in Colombia, we are facing air quality alerts. So this impact is very important for us. So it's very interesting that you, Diego, discuss how we have different kind of mechanisms to try to combat deforestation in Latin America. Thank you, Diego. The word is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this seminar. I'm very happy to meet you all, and I hope it's not the only time that I will be speaking to you. So I will be presenting this work that I've done for several years now with Alex Pfaff and Juan Robalino. And the title is Protected Areas, Deforestation, Spillovers, and Two Critical Mechanisms, an Empirical Exploration for the Brazilian Amazon. So as forest conservation efforts become more urgent, understanding their impacts is increasingly important, especially for developing countries. Conservation's multiple interactions with development processes are critical for thinking about not only what is optimal locally or globally, but also how desired change can come about. So this requires careful assessments, taking into consideration confounding factors, heterogeneity in impacts, and both environmental and socioeconomic outcomes. Protected areas are a key tool to protect forests, and as the impact evaluation literature continues to grow, there is more evidence showing that protected areas and development affect each other. So development affects not only the impacts, but also the likelihood of conservation policies. So for example, when roads raise agricultural profits, that raises resistance to protected areas, since the opportunity cost of conservation has increased. On the other hand, it raises the impact from protected areas that are well enforced, as keeping forests standing is meaningful against a backdrop of forest loss. Additionally, there is growing evidence of spillovers from conservation, which are driven by development responses and outcomes, and can thus shape the regional development path. So spillovers are unintended consequences of conservation in surrounding areas that should be considered in evaluation, but more studies on this topic are required. So the general question behind this work is, must conservation simply react to development, or could conservation agents anticipate which landscapes would generate a balance of environmental and development objectives, and then act to realize those patterns. So as far as we know, there exists a little, if any, evidence that conservation can have such impact. So not a lot of work is doing an analysis from this perspective. And what we want to do here is to investigate this question for an important case, that is the Brazilian Amazon, in looking at the protected areas and connections to road expansion and migration. So in terms of spillovers, what we're interested in first is on a local effect of protected area implementation on deforestation rates in nearby lands outside of the boundaries of the protected areas. Most existing evidence so far has found leakage or more deforestation around protected areas, but other effects might be possible depending on the context. So on socioeconomic drivers of protected area spillovers, studies have shown both conceptually and empirically the mechanisms for spillovers. For example, Pfaff and Rovalino 2017, they discuss 5 major channels by which spillovers can arise, one of them being input reallocation. And this is relevant for this study because we could think about land use restrictions such as protected areas shifting or displacing labor and capital to other locations nearby, lowering the cost of production there and raising deforestation, which would be the case of leakage. Another important mechanism that has been highlighted in the literature is tourism, but this one could actually raise net local benefits from conservation and block deforestation near PAs. However, we know this is not likely to be the case in an area that is as large and dense as the Brazilian Amazon, where the tourism industry doesn't represent such a large fraction of the economic activity. So 2 alternative explanations for the Brazilian Amazon that we explore here are decisions to on where to build roads and where to migrate. So our hypothesis is that conservation actions could signal changes in development investments, which may dissuade complementary behaviors, as I said, including roads and migrations, and this would underlie the observed forest spillovers. Roads can be understood as a public and private development decision when you have private actors involved in the creation of some of these roads. And these decisions would be affected by expected migrations, prior roads, development prospects, among other factors. And then you have migrations, which would be a private response to changes in expectations about employment and income, at least from a neoclassical view. And these two factors could actually be interacting with each other in space. And just to go back to the point about tourism, the main key element in this story is that protected areas in a place like the Amazon are not associated to economic opportunities that would drive development to these regions. And this is the different from a case, for example, like Costa Rica, where you see a set of economic activities associated to protected areas. And there's evidence of socioeconomic benefits associated to those activities. So in terms of the results that I will be showing, I'm going to start with first a paper that is already been published. And this is work again with Alex Pfaff and Juan Rovalino, where we explore the conditions for protected area internal impacts and spillovers, which is relevant for this conversation. And then we look at how different locations might affect that impact. We looked at the distinction between the arc of deforestation and the non-arc of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. We look at differences by state, by level of government, and that manage the protected areas. So the 3 levels here would be federal, state, and indigenous. And then we're gonna build on that evidence and try to start providing some information on the mechanisms that might be driving some of these spillover effects that we observed, looking at unofficial roads and then also human migrations. So just to clarify that point in time that we're interested in here, we are looking at deforestation changes around 2004. So we know that this was a very active period in terms of policies that were implemented in the Brazilian Amazon around this year. So we had an important expansion of protected areas. We had an action plan to prevent and control deforestation, and an important part of this plan was strengthening law enforcement and remote sensing monitoring to detect deforestation changes. And there were other policy innovations that were implemented at the local level, which also occurred around this time. And so what we're focusing on here is deforestation changes before 2004 and also after 2004, where you see this important drop in deforestation. Of course, we know this trend is reversing in recent years, but we would not be covering that period. So here I wanted to show the location of protected areas that are part of these analyses, and also the distinction between the arc of deforestation, which is the area in light green, covered by the states of Mato Grosso, Tocantins, Maranhão, Pará, and Rondônia. And that is the area where we would be focusing most of our analysis, because that's where we see evidence of significant impacts from protected areas. And as I mentioned before, we have 3 categories of protected areas: federal PAs, we have also state PAs, and indigenous territories. So indigenous territories would be determined by ancestral territories of these communities, which are located in all across the region, both close and far from pressure. We have that federal protected areas are mostly located in Pará, within the arc of deforestation, the area that we're interested in. State PAs, we have a number of protected areas managed by the state level in Mato Grosso. And as I said, indigenous, we have in multiple locations, multiple states across this region. In terms of the empirical approach for this paper, the first analysis of protected area impacts, we would be using pixel data on protected and non-protected areas. We would be looking at deforestation outcomes for the period of 2000, 2004, and also 2004, 2008. And we would be using a number of variables that would help us adjust for the determinants of deforestation, including factors like distance to roads and cities, distance to forest edge, soil fertility, vegetation, the slope of the terrain, rain index. And so it's an approach that it would be dependent on observable factors. In terms of the models and the approach that we use, we compare different matching methods: propensity score and nearest neighbor matching, also with post-matching regressions. We test the differences in the impact using across different categories of protection using OLS and matching as well. And we use clustering of standard errors by individual PAs. To help clarify the approach for defining treatments, when it comes to looking at spillover effects, we look at the pixels that are located in buffers of 10 to 20 and 30 kilometers around protected areas. So the treatment here is a proximity to the protected area, comparing those to controls outside of a 30-kilometer buffer. And then in terms of internal impacts, we would be looking at pixels inside the protected areas, inside the boundaries, comparing those to controls outside the 30-kilometer buffer. Okay, so I'm going to start presenting here some of the results of this paper. First, looking at the results of matching, and this is covariate matching or nearest neighbor matching, which is the the approach that resulted in a better post-matching balance between treated and untreated observations. And for the case of the outside of the arc of deforestation, so the non-arc area of the Brazilian Amazon with lower human pressure, in terms of internal impacts, we find pretty much insignificant results, or zero impact. Looking at the period of 2000 to 2004, and also 2004 to 2008. So this is something that has been documented in other work, and it's a result that just confirms the fact that there are no significant effects on avoided deforestation outside of the arc of deforestation. And similarly, no effects, no significant effect in terms of spillover effects, or the impact on deforestation in surrounding areas around the protected areas. And this result is the same for the three categories that I mentioned before: indigenous, federal, and state. Now, we start to analyze the states within the arc of deforestation, and starting here with internal impacts. For the state of Rondônia, what we find is an effect that is significant and is larger for indigenous territories, then followed by federal federal protected areas, and then state protected areas with less significant impacts on avoided deforestation. However, for Rondônia, no spillovers were found, no significant spillovers, only internal impacts. Then moving to Mato Grosso, we see that there's a higher effect on avoided deforestation from indigenous lands compared to state protected areas, but also no spillover effects in the case of Mato Grosso protected areas. And for the state of Pará, first looking at internal impacts, we see that there is a larger effect from federal protected areas compared to indigenous lands, although the two are significant. And in terms of spillovers, here we do find an effect from both indigenous territories and federal protected areas on spillover effects. And the interesting result is here that for indigenous, you see a positive effect, or an increase in deforestation around the protected areas, around indigenous territories, than otherwise, in the absence of the indigenous territory. And for the case of for federal protected areas, what you see is a negative effect, or a negative spillover effect, which would indicate lower deforestation around federal protected areas. So this is again the state where we find some evidence of these spillover effects, but it's interesting to see the difference between the two categories here: indigenous increasing, or having higher deforestation around their territories, and federal reducing deforestation. So these are some of the results that we then start to try to unpack in terms of what is the driver behind this spillover effects. And the first set of analysis that we do here to try to understand this mechanism is to look at the expansion of unofficial roads between 2003 and 2010. So this is using a data set that was produced by Amazon, and it's a data that allows to distinguish official roads and changes in official roads, as well as changes in unofficial roads, roads that may have been created by private actors for different purposes, as I'll describe in a second. But here in this map, what you can see is how these unofficial roads have been changing since 2003. So that area in light green is some of the unofficial roads created up to that point. Then we start to add new unofficial roads for 2007, a few additional ones for 2008, and then there's an important number of new roads in 2010. So this next snapshot, what is showing is some of the detail that you were not able to see in that previous map. But you can see that from official roads, the black roads, there is a good level of detail in terms of the information that this layer is giving us to understand where these new unofficial roads have been created and how they have been extensions of previous roads. So different studies have shown the importance of both official and unofficial roads as a determinant of deforestation, as you may be aware. Unofficial roads, in the case of the Brazilian Amazon, would be driven by private actors for access to land, timber, and other natural resources. In protected areas have been suggested to slow down the expansion of these unofficial roads, although not tested using quasi-experimental methods. So to analyze the impact of protected areas on official roads, we put together a data set of 547 municipalities in the Amazon biome. And the outcome of interest here is the increment in unofficial road density for two periods, 2003 and 2007, and then 2008 and 2010. These are based on Amazon data, as I said before, that were produced with Landsat images. And we incorporate a number of explanatory variables, including prior official and unofficial roads, the protected area categories that I mentioned before. Then we have other information on GDP per capita, population density, the area in forest, area in agriculture, the slope, the region where the municipality is located. And so these are some of the variables that we start to work with. And in terms of the approach for this analysis of roads, we use a combination of OLS regressions, standard OLS, and then different matching approaches. And first looking at all of the municipalities in the sample, and then focusing on the case of Pará, where we saw this stronger evidence of spillover effects. We then split the sample of protected areas, and we do the analysis for all of the PAs in the sample. We use a subset that we call the new PAs, which is those created between 2003 and 2008, and also old PAs, what we call old PAs, created before 2003, to then apply these different groups to the two periods of deforestation that we identified before. So in terms of the treatment, we're using here a dummy variable, which is the high PA density indicator, and then we also compare that to just a continuous variable of protected area within the municipality, or the percentage of the municipality that is being protected. So to show you some of the initial results, first we find that going first to the other variables that are not the protected area variables, we see that prior official road density has a positive effect on the increase in the density for unofficial roads, as would be expected given previous evidence in the literature on road dynamics. Then we have that higher levels of GDP per capita, population density, area in agriculture, prior forest cover, all seem to generate a larger increment in unofficial road density. The effect of the forest variable is consistent with studies suggesting that roads are being built in densely forested areas for extractive purposes. Higher slopes have a negative effect on the change in road density. And then in terms of the protected area impacts, we mostly observe negative coefficients. So significant effects for federal and indigenous protected areas, and not much action coming from state protected areas. So in that sense, the presence of federal and indigenous lands would be lowering the density in unofficial roads. So this is again an analysis that was done for all municipalities, but it's starting to hint at a potential mechanism for explaining spillovers, forest spillovers from protected areas. Then we look at an analysis only for the state of Pará, which was the state where we found those spillover effects before. And we find here stronger effects from federal. The effect from federal protected areas on official roads would be roughly double compared to what we saw in the full sample. Some negative coefficients coming from indigenous lands, but not as robust as the evidence for federal protected areas. And this is simple OLS regressions that we started to test. Then, as I said before, we were also looking at alternative protected area variables, looking at the continuous variable percentage of the municipality under protection. And we find similar results in the sense of a negative coefficient for federal and to some extent for indigenous land as well. But interestingly, for the case of OPAs, we see a positive coefficient for state protected areas. So potentially here an increase in road density, unofficial road density in the case of municipalities with this state protected areas. And the same is what we find when we do the analysis only for the state of Pará, but with a much stronger effect again for the federal protected areas. Just as an example of a robustness check that we started to do, we added not only the prior official roads, but also the prior unofficial road density, just to see how the results would change. And we see that in general, the results are not changing. There is a flip in the sign of one of these variables, since these are highly correlated, as you would expect. But you see a strong effect of the official roads, and as well as unofficial roads. So this is moving to the results of matching and comparing propensity score and covariate matching, looking at the sample of all municipalities in all states. And here we continue to see this negative coefficient for federal protected areas. There are some negative coefficients as well for indigenous that are consistent across the three columns that I have here with the different subsets of protected areas, but less consistent results for state protected areas. And again, the results that we are highlighting here is the covariate matching, where we saw a better post-matching balance between the treated and the untreated compared to propensity score. Similar results again for the case of Pará, but again the coefficients roughly double, and in some cases more than double for federal, which is a much stronger effect in this particular state. So consistent with the evidence from the other paper on protected area spillovers. So that is those are the last results on roads, and what I wanted to show you quickly is some initial results that we have on migration and how, you know, testing how the presence of protected areas could be affecting migration decisions in the region as another potential mechanism that we could explore. And there's, you know, we've done less work on this particular set of results, but I wanted to mention that we are working on it. And we use data from the 2010 census. So in this analysis, we have close to 50,000 individuals. We have data for 531 municipalities. And what we started testing is a logic model of outmigration at the individual level to test the impact of protected areas that were created in the municipality where these individuals were living. Protected areas created between 2000 and 2004, and how those affected migration decisions between 2005 and 2010. And this is a key piece of information in the census data where you can locate where the individual was 5 years ago and where they are located now. So we use this information to start building this model using a dependent variable with 1 as outmigration and 0 if the individual stayed in the same municipality during this period of analysis. And we started with this logic model approach, but I should mention that we also worked with other types of models, and we were doing also a multinomial logic type of analysis to look at decisions on where to locate across the entire region, not only the decision to outmigrate, but where to migrate. So that is a second stage of this analysis. But here, what I would show you is simply the results of the federal, state, and indigenous land variables. Federal protected areas, places that receive federal protected areas between 2000 and 2004 appear to have a positive effect on the outmigration decision. So a decision to relocate to another municipality, while the indigenous lands has a negative coefficient. So people that were there were not going anywhere else. They simply stayed in the same location. So I would like to summarize briefly the results. We find evidence of spillovers in the state of Pará in that paper that was already published. Federal protected areas show lower deforestation, while indigenous lands show higher deforestation in surrounding buffers. And here we also find that federal protected areas appear to slow down the expansion on unofficial roads, especially in Pará, with some reduction from indigenous lands as well, but not so much from state. We find initial evidence of PA creation having a positive effect on outmigration, just consistent with other results, but more analysis would be needed. Sorry. Then in terms of next steps, we would want to try for roads to test different treatments, alternative model specifications, interactions across municipalities, and look forward to gathering additional data on roads and population. We would also want to test different approaches for modeling development processes, migration, and road interactions. And one area that would be great to explore is the possibility of combining valuation and evaluation analysis to study local trade-offs across natural capital, produced capital, and human capital. And other topics of interest would be forest fragmentation and biodiversity impacts that we could further explore. So thank you very much. Welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Diego.
Diego.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jorge Maldonado, professor at Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, and president-elect of the Latin American Environmental and Resource Economics Association. I want to take this opportunity before starting with the question to remind you that the membership to the association, LAERE.org, is completely free for 2022. So please take this into account for your plans. We are having joint efforts with other associations from the American Association of Environmental Economists and the European Association of Environmental Economists to move into new joint activities, and we are starting to think on our participation in the World Congress of the Environmental Economists. So please keep an eye on the activities of the association. Having said that, I want to open the floor for questions. You can post your questions either in the chat, or you can just raise your hand, or you can just open your mic and mention your comments, questions, suggestions to the work that Diego had just presented. So please feel welcome to start commenting. Ariaster, please go ahead.
Hi, Jorge, thank you. Diego, first of all, this is good work. Thank you. I have two quick questions for you. The first one is that one thing that called my attention is the lack of effect or consistent effect when it comes to state PAs. And I wonder if this has anything to do with strategic behavior by the state politicians. So for example, I'm a state politician. I have an incentive to create a PA in the middle of nowhere where there's no competing use for the land and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if I am a federal politician, I am less sensitive to this types of pressure, and I might create PAs where there is more competing use for the land, and then I can see more spillovers and things like that, or a more significant internal impact as well. Keeping in mind that both federal and indigenous lands are determined at the federal level. The other question that I have was that when you looked at the map of roads, especially the illegal roads, most of the density of the roads seem to have come from the 2003 period. And I was curious to see if you have any information where the density of new roads is dominated by more recent roads, like 2008 and so on and so forth. So you can have a sense of the expanding frontier of deforestation. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. And on your first point, I think that your hypothesis there about the incentives between local and federal actors, I think that aligns well with our hypothesis as well in our suspicion about what are the political economy factors driving some of the level of enforcement that actually these agents are implementing on different types of protected areas. There is information on not only more resources on the side of the federal protected areas, but also systems in place to monitor the effectiveness of protected areas and pressures on deforestation. So those are elements that come into play, but also the fact that a lot of the costs that are being carried by the political actors would take place at the local level, and the costs associated with restricting land use. That might be another factor that could be coming into play. We know that certain protected areas in the state category were actually in areas of high pressure, areas where there was an active expansion of the agricultural frontier. So that is exactly where you would see this kind of conflict happening. And then in terms of where the new unofficial roads are coming, I think that is a good point that we need to explore further. We focus on the increment between one period and another period. So we look at the change between 2003 and 2007, and then the change between 2008 and 2010. But it is true that the map starts with a really dense density of unofficial roads in 2003, and I think we can take a closer look at where the new ones are showing up, just to give a little bit more information. But those are really welcome points.
Thanks. Very quickly on the first point, you might be perhaps able to test the hypothesis of the local incentives by looking at the characteristics of the PAs, both federal and state PAs. How much access to markets do they have, and land quality and things like that? Thank you, Diego.
Thank you.
Thank you. From our channel in YouTube, I have a question. Yadi Barrera is saying, do you think that these differences between indigenous and PAs are related to some weakness of enforcement of property rights or some institutional conditions?
That is a great question as well, and it is one of the key differences that we find in this set of results across this different set of analyses, the distinction between federal and indigenous. And even though they are both federal, managed by federal agencies, they would be very different in terms of the capacities to be able to enforce. As far as I understand from the indigenous territory perspective, there is a clear focus on protecting the boundaries of the territories, and they have been subject to different kinds of pressure, both from crop production, but also from other types of illegal activities, timber extraction, mining extraction. So I understand that a lot of the motivation from indigenous agencies would be to protect the existing territories, as opposed to giving a broader signal of where development may be going or may not be going, which could be a signal that is coming more strongly from the federal type of protected areas. So there is a difference in I think both in capacities and also in just think the priorities for the different agencies that are managing both indigenous and other federal protected areas.
Thank you, Diego. Any other questions? You can ask in Spanish if you want. Diego speaks Spanish as well. Pueden hablar en español. Si tienen alguna pregunta y quieren hacerla en español, también lo pueden hacer, que Diego habla español también. No sé si portugués.
A little bit. One point that I wanted to re-emphasize here, which I couldn't do because I had some cough attack that I need to take care of at the end. But here I want to make the point again that this analysis gives us great information of the sort of the effect of protected area on the local landscape. But it is really good, I think, to think about how to combine this kind of result with valuation data to be able to inform policymakers with more results on the trade-offs associated between all these different types of investments, right? So I work at the bank on the global environment unit, and we do a lot of global analysis of wealth and looking at trends in natural capital, produced capital, human capital. So a lot of our work there is on the valuation side and how these trends have changed over time for many countries. And a lot of the work that we do is bottom-up analysis, and we could use those kinds of models and results to inform what have been some of the trade-offs at this level, taking some of the per hectare values, for example, on forests or on agriculture, the human capital values, and looking at what has been the shift in terms of local wealth at the local or the regional level to arm policymakers a little bit better with how to make the decisions at what areas should be protected, what could be some of the consequences in terms of wealth in the region that might be affected by the spillover effects. I think it's an area that I've been thinking a lot about, and that I would welcome others' thoughts on this, as well as bringing additional resources on roads data. If others have information of other resources that could be useful to add more of a panel approach to this, because so far we've been limited by a few years where we have roads data and population data. We are aware there's more resources at the global level to do analysis of population data or nightlight data and all these. So it would be great to combine what we've done so far with additional resources and other ideas of how to model these dynamics, right, between migration and roads and protected areas.
And I can imagine that in that process of analyzing wealth, you have to consider the trade-off between wealth from natural capital and wealth from agricultural or handmade capital after deforestation, no? And when you have this country with such a huge biodiversity and the challenges associated to evaluating this wealth associated to this biodiversity might imply also a challenge in the approach for estimating these values.
Right. And but a lot, the bank has worked a lot on this type of approaches. So there's already a lot of information that we could build on. But I think what is could be most relevant would be to really be clear to policymakers about what is the trade-off here, and from the conservation perspective, be more realistic about what are the displacements that are occurring, right? To be able to tell a policymaker, well, we need to compensate these areas in other ways. If we see a displacement in producer human capital, we need to make sure that this natural capital that is staying here is valued in such a way that compensates.
Exactly. Well, while we have any other questions, I want to mention, Diego, your work remind me a work by Camilo de los Rios. He published the paper, I think, last year, and he was trying to, he was analyzing the effect in Colombia of having, at the same time that it happens in Colombia, I don't know if it happens in Brazil, that having at the same time a protected area and an indigenous resguardo, an indigenous territory. And he found that there is an important synergistic effect when you have at the same time a protected area meant for conservation and an indigenous territory meant for ethnic reasons. Do you have this condition in Brazil, or did you have the opportunity of thinking on that?
So it's both conservation and protection of an indigenous territory.
Indigenous territories, yes.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point because and there's a key difference, I think, between these two categories that we look at, federal and indigenous, where one is, the objective of conservation is much clearer than when you have indigenous territory, where the idea is to protect these ancestral territories, and there is of course a conservation effort within that. And there may be just differences across different indigenous groups as well, and resources available for monitoring and all this. But that's an interesting idea to make sure that these are kind of explicitly set to have both objectives.
Yeah, in the same territory.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it happens in Colombia. One of the indigenous territories are then assigned as part of a protected area, a natural protected area. Then indigenous leaders end up negotiating with the conservation leaders of the managers of the park to define the activities in this particular land that have both institutions at the same time.
Yep.
Well, any other question? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Nos quedan 3 o 4 minutos para algún comentario. 3 or 4 more minutes for comments, questions, suggestions. Okay, so in that case, I think that we can close the session. Diego, on behalf of the Environment for Development Initiative and the LAERE, we want to thank for your presentation. It was very interesting, and I think it's a good start for this year's seminar series. Remember, we are having this series the first Wednesday of each month. So we can see 1 month from now and have our second seminar series session in which we are dealing with these issues related to conservation and development, mainly in development regions. So thank you so much. Jorge, you want to mention, or Diego?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. A pleasure.
Thank you very much, Diego. Thank you, everyone, for joining to this session of the seminar. Thanks. As Jorge says, we will be having more seminars in the next months. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, Diego.